Welcome to this week's Quick Charge. The Apostle Peter said love will be a canopy over a multitude of sins. We can conclude from this that love covers others. Now, it doesn't cover up sin, but it covers those whose sins and faults and flaws are glaringly obvious. Covering is a biblical concept. Coverings are the pattern of heaven, and on earth, covering took on a much greater meaning as it addressed the nakedness of man. So to love is to cover. To walk in love is to cover. But why does God call us to cover one another? Last week we saw it was an act of honor, but it's also an act of grace. One of the definitions of cover is to overshadow, and it is used in the imagery of the mercy seat, where the wings of the cherubim covered or overshadowed the ark. To overshadow is to make something else much more important than the obvious, to make it a bigger deal, a higher priority than the flaws. Love overshadows people's faults. It makes mercy and forgiveness and forbearance and patience, compassion, restoration, and redemption a bigger deal than their failings and flaws. Noah had 3 sons. One son saw the nakedness of his father, and he was supposed to cover it on his own, by himself. But he chose not to overshadow it, but to make it central, to spread it, to talk about it. The Bible says he saw and he told. He exposed it. He uncovered his father's nakedness to his brothers who were outside, who were not even involved in it. They were not a party to it. He had no other possible motive than to make his father look bad and to be dishonorable in the eyes of his brothers, and to elevate his own place, being the second born. Noah's other 2 sons chose not to look upon the nakedness of their father, even though it could have been plainly seen. They chose not to approach it, but rather to cover it. They overshadowed it. The Bible says their faces were backwards. They walked backwards to cover him. That's not a natural act, with their faces purposely looking in the opposite way. Sadly, the one who refused to cover was cursed, while those who chose the grace of covering were blessed. Grace says, I could look, I could expose, I could shame, I could make it central, but I choose to overshadow and cover it. But it's also an act of faith. Whenever Israel journeyed, everything of value had to be covered. And those acts of covering, that entire process, that was a sign that they were moving on, that they were going forward, because there's more. It's not the end. This is not over. There's more, something better. The best is ahead. Noah was not at his best when he needed to be covered after what he had done. In fact, this might have been his absolute worst. Covering says, you're not at your best right now. Maybe you're at your worst, but I believe God is at work in you, just like me. There is more, and your best in God is yet to come. God has not written you off, and neither have I, even though you look like a total write-off at the moment. Love covers people at their worst, with a view toward the best that is coming. That's an act of faith. The very first act of the followers of Jesus after the cross was to cover that body that was broken, blemished, bruised, with all of its obvious flaws and defects. A body that looked too beat up to bother with, or even to bury. But they covered it anyway. Will you choose the way of honor, grace, and faith? Join me next week for another quick charge. God bless.